And I cherish all of the freedoms that we got, including the right to burn the flag. But I also got the right to bear arms, and if you burn mine, I'll shoot you.
Charlie Kirk is gone. A sharp, polarizing, and undeniably influential voice in American politics, silenced. At just 31 years old, Kirk had built Turning Point USA into a movement that energized millions of young conservatives. But on September 10, 2025, everything stopped. During a speaking engagement at Utah Valley University, Charlie was assassinated in a violent act that sent shockwaves across the country. His death sparked national mourning, bipartisan outrage, and a flurry of questions about the rising temperature of American discourse. While political divides remain, today we begin not with debate, but with respect. Charlie Kirk was a son, a leader, a believer. And as millions try to make sense of the tragedy, one question has emerged in online forums, churches, and coffee shops alike. Would legendary country icon Johnny Cash, the man in black, have stood beside Charlie Kirk? Let's go deeper. To answer whether Johnny Cash would have supported Charlie Kirk, we have to understand the man behind the music. Johnny Cash was never predictable. He walked between worlds, gospel and rock, rebellion and righteousness, sin and redemption. Born in Kingsland, Arkansas, during the Great Depression, Cash's life was forged in hard times. His family picked cotton. He grew up hearing the cries of the working poor, the rhythm of trains, and the hymns of Sunday service. These sounds, soaked in dust and faith, molded his music. But his worldview? That was more complex. Cash was deeply spiritual, fiercely patriotic, and always protective of the underdog. He performed for prisoners. He protested war, but honored the military. He sang for Jesus, but drank himself into oblivion. He didn't fit into categories, and he never wanted to. Politically, Johnny Cash played it close to the vest. He never endorsed a candidate. In fact, he said in a 1990 interview, "I'm not political, I'm spiritual." And yet, he was always vocal about morality, justice, and truth. He once sang, "What is truth?" in front of Richard Nixon, and challenged the president to listen to the voice of the youth. It was bold, it was uncomfortable, and it was very Johnny. So, would he have supported Charlie Kirk? It depends on how we define support. Would he have agreed with every political stance? Unlikely. But would he have seen Charlie as a young man driven by purpose, faith, and conviction? Possibly. Cash valued courage. He didn't believe in silence when your beliefs were on the line. He might have admired Charlie's fearless approach to public debate, so long as it was rooted in something deeper than division. But we must also consider this. Johnny Cash hated injustice. He loved those the world left behind. If he saw any cruelty, verbal or political, he would have called it out, no matter where it came from. Cash's compass didn't swing left or right. It pointed toward the cross. And maybe, just maybe, that's the lens he would have used to see Charlie Kirk. A man trying to change the world. A man who paid the ultimate price. A man who believed, loudly. Johnny Cash was never just a singer. He was a symbol of contradiction. A vessel for America's most difficult truths. Born in the depths of the Great Depression in rural Arkansas, Cash saw the world through a lens shaped by struggle, faith, and music. He sang for the broken, the forgotten, and the misunderstood, not because it was popular, but because it was honest. Songs like Man in Black weren't fashion statements. They were personal manifestos. Cash said he wore black for the poor, the prisoner, the beaten down, and the voiceless. It was his way of bearing public witness to the invisible pain around him. That wasn't politics. That was moral clarity. And then there was What Is Truth? A track that dared to challenge political power during a time when doing so wasn't safe. When Cash performed that song in front of President Richard Nixon, it was a bold, clear-eyed message about generational disillusionment, war, and leadership. He didn't perform it to antagonize, but to provoke reflection. He also recorded a full album called Bitter Tears, advocating for Native American rights, a stance that was controversial and led to some radio stations refusing to play his songs. Cash responded not with anger, but with a letter to those stations, challenging them to listen with empathy. Johnny Cash didn't follow any party line. He was fiercely independent, religious but not preachy, patriotic but not blind, traditional but not trapped. He didn't fit the mold of any ideology. If anything, he rejected the idea of being politically labeled altogether. So, if we're asking whether Johnny Cash would have supported Charlie Kirk, we have to step back. Johnny Cash didn't offer endorsements. He asked questions. He listened. He stood with people, not platforms. What mattered to him was whether a movement upheld the dignity of the forgotten, the broken-hearted, the outcast. Cash might have admired Kirk's passion or conviction. But he also would have asked, who benefits? Who suffers? Does this path lead to healing or division? Because for Johnny Cash, truth wasn't easy. It was hard-won, soaked in tears, shaped by mistakes, and always accompanied by mercy. That was his real campaign, truth with heart. When news broke of Charlie Kirk's death, it shook a specific part of America. Love him or not, he was a lightning rod for conviction. To millions of young conservatives, he was more than a political voice. He was a symbol of resistance, of pushing back against a cultural tide they felt was erasing tradition, faith, and patriotism. And while others disagreed with his tone or views, very few could deny his impact. As tributes flooded in, from quiet social media posts to tearful podcast episodes, the country paused. Some mourned a friend, some mourned a fighter, and others simply mourned a man. Because no matter the politics, every life lost sends a ripple through someone's heart. Now, imagine this moment through the eyes of Johnny Cash. Imagine him sitting in a quiet chapel, guitar by his side, wrestling with the loss. He didn't know Charlie Kirk personally, but he knew what it meant to carry a message so loudly that the world either loved you or hated you for it. He knew what it meant to be misunderstood, mislabeled, and yet never silenced. Johnny had a special reverence for the dead. After all, this was the man who recorded "The Man Comes Around," a song soaked in apocalyptic vision, warning, and grace. He believed in judgment, but he also believed in forgiveness. He believed that people could change, that no soul was beyond redemption. Would Johnny have issued a tweet? Probably not. That wasn't his way. But he might have sung a song, one of grief, one of uncertainty, one asking the same questions many are asking now. What was he chasing? What legacy did he leave? And are we listening? Or just shouting back at each other? In Charlie Kirk, Johnny might have seen a younger version of himself, angry at injustice, loud with belief, yearning to be heard. But he also might have challenged him to soften, to listen more. That's the paradox of Johnny Cash, a man who stood firm but knelt often. This isn't about endorsement, it's about empathy, about acknowledging that behind every microphone is a beating heart, behind every tweet, a wounded spirit. And when someone dies, the first thing Johnny Cash would have done is pray. To understand whether Johnny Cash might have supported Charlie Kirk, you have to understand the kind of man Cash really was. Not just the outlaw dressed in black, not just the rebel who played prisons and walked the line, but the man who lived in a constant tug-of-war between righteousness and ruin. Johnny Cash was a man of faith, deep, abiding, and often messy faith. He believed in Jesus Christ with every fiber of his being, but he also believed that following Christ wasn't about politics or posturing. It was about humility, compassion, and repentance. He didn't preach at people, he sang to them. He didn't condemn from a podium, he sat down beside the broken. Charlie Kirk, for all the fire he carried into political arenas, also carried his own version of faith. His organization, Turning Point USA, frequently emphasized biblical values, traditional family structures, and public prayer in schools. To many of his supporters, Charlie wasn't just a political voice. He was a modern crusader for Christian principles in a society they believed had lost its moral compass. But this is where Johnny might have paused. Johnny Cash had seen how religion could be weaponized. He'd watched televangelists scream about sin while ignoring the poor. He knew that faith wasn't about who yelled the loudest, but who loved the deepest. And he wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy, even in the church. That might have made him cautious of Charlie's more militant tone. Still, there was overlap. Both men believed America was in danger of forgetting its roots. Both believed in redemption, not just spiritually, but culturally. And both believed that one voice, even if it was hated, could change a nation. But where Charlie fought with statistics and sound bites, Johnny fought with songs and silence. And where Charlie often leaned into confrontation, Johnny leaned into contradiction, sitting with prisoners one day, then praying with presidents the next. Would Johnny have supported everything Charlie said? No. Would he have agreed with every method? Probably not. But would he have offered Charlie grace in death? Without question. Because if there's one thing Johnny Cash believed, it's that the measure of a man isn't taken when he's shouting, but when the world goes quiet after he's gone. When it came to politics, Johnny Cash was always hard to pin down. He wasn't the kind of man to slap a bumper sticker on his guitar case or wear a party pin on his chest. He voted yes. He cared deeply about America's direction, but he didn't see himself as a Democrat or a Republican. He saw himself as a voice for the unheard. That's where things start to get complicated when asking if Johnny Cash would have supported Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk was overtly political. He built Turning Point USA to energize young conservatives and openly advocated for right-leaning policies. He confronted cultural decay with firebrand speeches and stood against what he saw as a radical left movement that was undermining traditional American values. But Johnny didn't pick sides like that, not publicly, and not in sound bites. He famously refused to endorse Richard Nixon during the height of the Vietnam War, even when invited to the White House. And yet, he did perform for multiple presidents, including Nixon, Reagan, and both Bushes. He wasn't being inconsistent, he was being human. He understood that each man in power was flawed, but he still saw it as his duty to speak truth, no matter who sat behind the desk in the Oval Office. That brings us to today's question. Would Johnny Cash have appeared on stage with Charlie Kirk? Maybe. Maybe not. But what's certain is that he wouldn't have shouted him down either. Cash's approach to influence wasn't about taking over a room. It was about walking into a room quietly, observing it deeply, and then saying something so truthful it pierced through all the noise. Johnny believed in the power of the individual. He believed in personal responsibility, faith, and second chances. In those ways, he and Charlie might have found some common ground. But Cash also believed that music, empathy, and unity should come before division, and that moral strength came not from yelling louder, but from living better. He sang for prisoners and presidents, for Democrats and Republicans, for sinners and saints. He understood that the real battle wasn't between left and right. It was between darkness and light. And the light, to Johnny, didn't wear a political party's name. So would he have supported Charlie Kirk? Not with a banner, not with a hashtag. But he may have seen a young man trying to shape the world through conviction, and offered him something few others did in these times: grace without approval, and truth without hate. In today's culture, everyone has an opinion, and everyone feels compelled to share it. A single tweet can ignite a firestorm. A podcast appearance can shift an entire public narrative. But Johnny Cash came from a different time, where silence, when chosen wisely, could speak louder than any microphone ever could. Charlie Kirk, by contrast, was a voice of this era, bold, fast-moving, and unafraid to stir the pot. Whether you agreed with him or not, he never stayed quiet about what he believed. He leaned into the whirlwind. But Johnny Cash? Johnny watched the storm from a rocking chair on the porch and waited to speak when it mattered most. That's why his silence on certain issues wasn't indifference. It was discipline. Johnny didn't believe in shouting over people. He believed in listening. In the end, that's what makes the question of whether he would have supported Charlie Kirk so fascinating. Because sometimes, what someone doesn't say is more telling than anything they ever write in a letter or sing in a verse. We can imagine Johnny quietly observing Charlie's rise, watching this young man rally conservative college students, challenge institutions, and stir up culture war debates. Johnny might have understood the fire behind Charlie's words, and he might have also seen the danger in moving too fast, too loud, too aggressively. He'd seen what happened when voices that aimed to unify instead began to divide. But here's the thing. Johnny Cash believed in the redemption of men. He believed that the hardest roads were often the ones that led to truth. He'd seen rock bottom. He'd climbed out of it. And he believed that conviction was worth more than popularity. In that sense, perhaps he would have respected Charlie, not for his politics, but for his courage to stand up for what he believed, regardless of the backlash. Still, Johnny wouldn't have rushed to a camera to say so. He might have sent a handwritten letter, or shown up to a funeral when no one else expected him to. That was the kind of man he was: quiet, watchful, present. In an age where silence is seen as weakness, Johnny Cash used it like a sword. And in the conversation surrounding Charlie Kirk's life and impact, it's the kind of silence that forces all of us to ask, what do we stand for when the lights go out and the noise fades? To truly understand where Johnny Cash might have stood on someone like Charlie Kirk, you have to step away from the headlines and into the songs. Because Johnny didn't write op-eds, he didn't campaign for causes or parties. But he did write lyrics that pierced the human soul, often speaking more truth in 3 verses than most politicians can manage in a lifetime. What did Johnny believe in? Look at the lyrics of The Man in Black. In that anthem, Cash explains why he wore black, not for fashion, not for rebellion, but for the poor, the prisoner, the war-torn, and the forgotten. It was a protest song, but not against a party. It was against apathy, against a world that had stopped listening to the cries of the broken. He sang for the underdog, the addict, the sinner, and the saved. His songs wrestled with God, with guilt, with pride, and with redemption. He didn't hide his scars, he put them on full display, and in doing so, gave others permission to face their own. Now imagine him hearing about Charlie Kirk. Not just the activist or the political firebrand, but the person. A young man who rose fast, stirred controversy, spoke to millions, and died before his time. Would Johnny have agreed with his politics? Maybe not. But would he have understood the weight Charlie carried? Probably more than most. Johnny Cash knew what it was like to be a voice in the wilderness. He'd stood at the edge of addiction, nearly lost everything, and clawed his way back. He knew the kind of pain that doesn't always show on camera. And maybe he would have wondered what kind of private demons Charlie battled behind closed doors. Johnny's music always pointed to grace. Even when he sang about judgment, he left a door open for mercy. That's why people from every walk of life loved him. He was complicated. Human. A man of God who never pretended to be perfect. A rebel who prayed. If he were here today, Johnny might not speak out in an interview. He might not take to social media or release a statement. But maybe, just maybe, he'd write a quiet verse, a sad melody, a simple refrain that said more than any press conference ever could. Because for Johnny Cash, music wasn't just art. It was how he told the truth. And when it came to judging another man, especially one gone too soon, he'd let the song do the talking, and let the rest of us listen. In the end, asking whether Johnny Cash would have supported Charlie Kirk isn't just about politics. It's not even about approval or disapproval. It's about understanding what kind of man Johnny Cash truly was, and what he represented. Johnny was a seeker, a man constantly grappling with the flaws of the world and the darkness within himself. And yet, he never gave up on the idea that people could change, that they deserved compassion, that even the loudest voices still carried pain inside them. Charlie Kirk, no matter where you stand on his views, was a man who carried a mission. He believed in what he spoke about. He stirred passion in people, challenged ideas, and tried to wake up a generation, one way or another. That's not so different from Johnny in his prime, the black-clad outsider walking into rooms that didn't welcome him, the man who stood on prison stages and sang songs of grace to men the world had forgotten. If Johnny Cash were watching today, seeing the nation react to Charlie's sudden death, he might say nothing at first. He might just sit with his guitar, like he always did, letting the storm pass. But then, as always, he'd remind us of something deeper. That it's easy to praise people when they're gone, but it's harder to understand them while they're still here. And even harder still, to offer them grace. He once said, "You build on failure. You use it as a stepping stone. Close the door on the past. You don't try to forget the mistakes, but you don't dwell on it." That's the spirit he would have brought to a moment like this. Not a political endorsement, not a condemnation, but a hope. That maybe we can stop shouting long enough to listen, that maybe we can meet people where they are, and that maybe, just maybe, we can build something better. Not by choosing sides, but by choosing truth and mercy at the same time. Johnny Cash probably wouldn't have tweeted about Charlie Kirk. He wouldn't have gone on a podcast. But his silence wouldn't have meant indifference. It would have meant reverence. For a young man's life, now ended. For the fire he carried. And for the ache that so often lies beneath the surface of all of us. In this moment, we're left with two names, Charlie Kirk, Johnny Cash. Different eras, different missions, but perhaps in the end, connected by one unshakable truth. They both believed the world needed saving, and they both tried, in their own way, to do something about it.